Hello, everyone. I'm Likita, the Secretary of the Global Mobility Club at UTD. Welcome to the Global Mobility Club's webinar speaker series. The mission and vision of our club is to bring awareness and empower the students of UTD, especially the JSOM students, to pursue global mobility. And this semester, we are conducting several events, a case competition, the speaker series that we are having this week, and then we also have a career fair, which is in the coming week. Anyone interested can always check our LinkedIn profile and get registered to any of the events that you're interested in. And today's webinar speaker is Keryn Mendes, the Global Mobility Manager at Aurecon. And Aurecon is a design, engineering, and advisory company which especially focuses on the eminence, digital, and innovation. Aurecon has a very strong presence across Australia, New Zealand, and Asia. Our speaker, Keryn, with 17 years of experience across multiple industries and regions, is now leading the global mobility in the Aurecon, global mobility program in the Aurecon. Her passion of global mobility made her the multi-award winner as Global Mobility Champion. She's the top 250 global mobility professional and top 100 global innovators. And today she's going to speak about the innovation strategy and sustainability. Also, she supports sustainability by hosting industry forums, driving through leadership in mobility, environment, and sustainability. I will hand over the screen to you, Keryn.
Thanks, Lakita. Hi, everybody. Lovely to see you. Let me just get my screen up. If you could give me a thumbs up if you can see that, that would be great.
Yes, we are able to see your screen.
Beautiful. Thank you. It's really great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me back to work with UTD. And it's really great to virtually be presenting to you all. I wish I could see your faces, but yeah, hopefully you enjoy the presentation today. And I understand you've had some really great presenters to date. So thanks for your time and attention. So as Lakita mentioned, I'm going to talk to you today around the current trends of innovation strategy and sustainability for global mobility, and particularly being based in the APAC region. This is going to come from our perspective within region. At the moment, most of the regions are working on their respective strategies, but we look to bring those together as a united global mobility industry as we move forward on determining what those guidelines are. In relation to innovation, so this is a really interesting space in the fact that I think in the last probably more so 10 years, global mobility has taken leaps and bounds when it comes to their approach about how to execute a mobility program. There are two kind of areas that we generally try to tackle as global mobility professionals when it comes to innovation. And the first of those is policy. That's where we can, I guess, make our biggest bang for buck and where we have our greatest level of influence. The policy sector is one full of thought and thought leadership, but there is often too some really innovative solutions that come out through various leaders, various parts of the industry, and that are suitable for the particular program that the individual is working on. So I guess the biggest theme around managing your policy, or when you look at policies around global mobility, it's kind of always try to look at it to challenge the status quo. Never rest on your laurels when it comes to managing expat assignments or developing policy around managing expat assignments. The shift more so in the last 10 years has definitely been around reflecting and supporting the generational shift. And by that, I mean, as we see I don't know what generation we're up to now, but Generation I and the rest coming through, these generations are looking at their careers in a very different way compared to Gen X and Gen Y. And so we're seeing a lot more lateral moves through organizations. So at level, rather than the typical hierarchical moves up. So this results in an appetite for mobility packages in a different way that has been consumed previously. So a lot of organisations, particularly your Big Four or your banking sectors, will look to have graduate programs that offer more leaner packages, but are more widely available to that level of employee. Whereas traditionally, if you go back, say, 10, 15 years, global mobility programs were really only available to senior level executives and was more so a part of their developmental plan. So you often had to, work a good 15, 20 years before you had access to be able to go on an expat assignment. So now we're seeing that shift to that being offered more readily to the younger term career employees. And that's great from the perspective of giving them that world experience. But then it's also being used as an attraction tool as well to a lot of individuals looking to have that global experience. Some of the other approaches that have been used more recently in relation to policies, and this first one particularly in relation to lump sum and moving yourself, appeals a lot given the cost, the downward pressures we have on cost at the moment in relation to global mobility. And that's not specific in relation to global mobility. There's supply and demand issues in result of the coming out of COVID, the war in Ukraine. And so all those external factors are pushing down across the industry in various ways. And a really great example of that is accommodation. Accommodation during the last 12 months has been quite hard to find from an availability, thus driving the cost up. And that's in the temporary accommodation and in the rental space as well. While people move from their 4 weeks of transitioning into something more permanent, a lot of employees, particularly in the APAC region, were struggling to find somewhere to move to on a long-term basis. So the cost of those services were moving up. And so one of the ways that organisations were approaching helping with that was providing lump sums. So that was effectively cash to the individual, which gave them flexibility to be able to choose the style that they wanted and put the cost towards a solution that they preferred. The other popular trend that's been on the rise, particularly in relation to the rise in the tech sector and startups in that space, has been one-way move. So moving away from the traditional assignment approach, so the long-term, the short-term assignment, but offering one-way moves and often sometimes coupling that with a lump sum approach. So these can be interchangeable as well. And that would, again, provide the individual with a lot more flexibility around their move. Those types of move types do come with a little bit of a warning flag in the fact that if you're giving people one-way moves, they obviously have no right of reply no right of return in relation to coming back to their country of origin. And so that, depending on your population, depends on whether that's attractive or not. Some people like that ability to be able to return, particularly where they have benefits that are tied to their employment back in the home country. And Australia, where I live, is a great example of that. We have an employment condition called long service leave, which is effectively a leave type that accrues in the background while you're at an organisation, and it's in complementary, so it's in addition to your annual leave or your PTO, and it sits in the background and accrues and accrues and accrues. And under legislation, that long service leave at a particular point, depending on where you live in Australia, realises at a certain point in Victoria, I think where I live, it's 7 years. And at that point, you can take a lump sum amount of leave in addition to your annual leave. So when people are working in Australia, based in Australia, and they're offered perhaps a one-way move where they have to physically resign from their Australian entity and move to another country, they're giving up that entitlement. And that's a big deal because that's a big chunk of leave that they have accruing in the background. And that's just an example of some of the things that you need to factor into your policies around what's important to your employee base around their employee benefits. But yeah, so those particular assignments around one-way moves are really interesting because it has been really popular in the tech sector, whereas traditionally the assignment structure of a policy. So short-term, long-term, commuter, FIFO, assignment types have been kind of the staple when it comes to mobility over the last, 20 years. And so that shift to one-way moves, whilst it's appropriate for some sectors and not for all, it certainly is a lot simpler from an administration and program management perspective. The other types of mobility packages that we're seeing a rise on in probably the last 5 years, really interesting. So it's taking a different look at how you present your mobility packages. So some of the banking sector and the mining sector have looked at and have in place points-based programs. And so that's designed to address the consumer-driven choices that, and again, give that control back to the employee moving. So the programs often look very different in their makeup, but the fundamental point is to give that control back. And so sometimes you'll find that organisations have points-based programs where they have a set amount of points, either based on the seniority or based on their business stream or their group, or they may have a certain amount of points to be allocated to certain provisions. So you might get X amount of points to use on accommodation, and you might have X amount of points to use on shipping, for example, and these perhaps can be traded off if you're looking to, maybe you don't want to move your household of goods, maybe you want to sell it all, and you want to use those points towards something else like cultural training to help you get started on the ground. So again, it provides that flexibility, control back to the employee, and is a really neat way to take the focus off the cash element of policies. Because often when, and this is one of the catches, I guess, when you look at a lump sum or a cash amount offering for a mobility program, it does encourage a focus on the cash element of the conversation. And so to move away from that points-based system is a really nice way to give that flexibility, but have the narrative move away from the cash and have the focus to be on the service and the employee experience. The other piece there in innovation that's come a long way in the last probably 15 years is technology. When I first got into the industry almost 17 years ago, the definition of technology was an Excel spreadsheet when it came to mobility. And we're all guilty of still using Excel spreadsheets because they're just so agile and so flexible. But there has been a really fast, sharp rise in relation to mobility management software, which is really great to see. Initially, broadly speaking, it just kind of started within the big fours themselves. And at that time, 10 years ago, those solutions were quite expensive, as all technology solutions in the world were expensive at that time. And the big four were already using it in-house themselves. So they started to see the value in offering it to their clients who they were managing mobility programs for. And so if you had engagements with your big four, say PwC, Deloitte, KPMG, they would offer this solution as part of any tax engagement that you may have with them. So at that point, if you did have engagements in other areas, there was a value add around using this platform, and a lot of those early day users gave feedback that went into developing the software that we see today. As a technology skill set got cheaper, so too did the development of these programs, and so too did the offering. These days, we often see mobility management software through the likes of your big fours being offered complimentary in relation to your services rather than having to pay an annual subscription fee. So that's shifted, which is great for the end user, which is the corporation. But then what we've also seen in the last 10 years is a rise around tech companies developing software for the mobility industry and other industries, but they're not primarily mobility companies at their core. They're tech companies, but they've identified that there is a need for mobility management software specifically. And so they've looked to develop really smart solutions with a tech lens first rather than a mobility lens first, which has driven some really great solutions. And we're seeing those come out for examples. So there is a a temporary accommodation tool at the moment, which acts very much like a Google Maps style, where you can effectively give the control to the employee to look at an area, say Singapore, for example, and they can drill down and see the organizational available accommodation in that area. They can also see how close to that is a bank, a library, a school. So rather than looking at static pages of temporary accommodation providers and not really understanding where that fits into the ecosystem of where they're going to be living, they can then have that interactive experience, and then it makes their choice a lot easier when it comes to things like temporary accommodation. The other really cool thing that's coming through, and I think this is probably bigger in the US where you guys are as opposed to APAC, but virtual reality is starting to creep into global mobility, where traditionally for an international assignment, most policies would have some sort of look-see visit or pre-trip or pre-assignment visit, where the individual, the employee would take their spouse and they would go to the new destination and they would get a look and feel to understand whether it's appropriate for them to live, especially when they have children. So what's being trialled at the moment is around doing that, but in a virtual reality sense. So, you know, the big masks, the big goggles, and immersing that employee and their spouse in that experience, rather than putting them on a plane, spending that money, spending that carbon footprint, and sending them to that location for a handful of days to kind of get that experience. We're yet to see how this is uptaken in the industry. We're yet to see how this plays out. And again, as that technology gets better in that space, I think we'll probably see that adopted more widely. So that's the innovation arm. Lakitha, I just thought I'd pause there to see if there are any questions in relation to that.
We have one question, Keryn.
Sure.
How do you see global mobility evolving in the next 5 to 10 years, and what implications will this have for companies and employees working in this field?
Sure. It's a great question. If you had asked me that 5 or 10 years ago, as many of us was, I wouldn't have predicted we're probably where we are now, but we had the pandemic to thank or to blame for much of where we sit today. But I guess looking forward 5 to 10 years, I think particularly this technology space that I just spoke about, we're going to see a lot more leaps and bounds in relation to that, particularly when it comes to understanding our program population. So, and by that, I mean, we get a deeper dive into our diversity lens of our population. So there's been for a few years conversations around female representation in organisations, and particularly in mobility in the assignment arena. How many females do we have on assignment? Now we're starting to look at that a bit more wider and look at our diversity cohort in its entirety. So not just limiting that to females, but extending that out to the wider diversity group. And so I think the technology, from some of the demos I've seen recently, they're starting to delve into that and be able to carve up that data. Now that obviously requires wider than just mobility management software being able to capture that data. But I think once we get a good handle, and 5-10 years is a good period in which to capture meaningful data. In that time, if we can start to carve that up and be able to pull some metrics around that, around what our diverse mobility or mobilised population looks like, that'll allow us to feed back to the organisation around early career entry, which will influence wider career planning for the organisation. So that's one area I think that in particular in the next 5 to 10 years that will really grow. I think too what will happen is we will continue to see the trend around less traditional mobility programs. I think the days of the full-blown long-term assignment with all the bells and whistles that is quite expensive, that is really not great for our carbon footprint, we'll probably see that continue to slow down. It already has in the last 5 years, but we'll see that trend continue. And I think we'll probably continue to see a rise of the more leaner packages, potentially more one-way moves as people get more used to that concept of leaving where they are and picking up in a new location, that less of tying back to the home base. And so I think whilst in the last 10 years we've seen some of the policy changes that I've presented, I think we'll see tweaks to those. Nothing hugely different outside of that, but I think we'll see the trends grow towards more of that self-service, employee-initiated driven assignments as we kind of move out of the COVID and people have that flexibility and appetite to travel and have international experiences again. Thanks, Lakita. Great question.
Yeah, I have a question following this. So with this
Sure.
level of technology evolving, are there any significant challenges that the company should look out for in the coming years, like you've mentioned?
I think data privacy and cybersecurity are obviously massive pieces of the technology solution. And I'm not sure how it's faring in the US, but particularly in Australia here, in the last, even 12 months, 2 years, we've seen a really sharp rise on cyber attacks, just across all industries, not just the one I work in, not just the mobility sector itself, but across health, communications. We've seen a really widespread kind of approach to that threat. And so organisations, whilst they had and they still do have quite robust technology solutions in the background supporting not only their mobility program but their organisation in general, I think they're needing to accelerate some of those solutions that they have in place and enhance their security and cyber risk profile and mitigate their risk profile in relation to increasing their technology solutions. And so that obviously filters down to the mobility management software solutions that are in play. Many of the solutions out there already have identified this increase in the last 12 months, 2 years, and have taken measures in place. But for those managing programs that are still on Excel spreadsheet, which there are still many of us, we just need to be careful about where we're storing that data, how we're managing it. And because we're dealing in employee personal detail day in, day out, and in particular, a classic one of that is passport details. There's nothing more sensitive than someone's passport details. So we just need to be really careful about where we're storing those. And whilst you can have a good mobility management software solution in place, you also need to have good practices and hygienes around that as well, and good behaviours in your team to make sure that you're managing the transfer of that information appropriately.
Thanks, Keryn. That was informative. One more question on innovation.
Sure.
What has the most impactful innovation to the global mobility industry been in the recent years?
Oh, good question. Making
me
think. What's been the most impact innovations of mobility? I think I'd have to say, and this is probably going to be an answer for most things, so it sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but I think it's horrible as it was, the pandemic, it accelerated everything. But I think it accelerated mobility and the need for innovation in mobility more than anything else. It certainly elevated mobility's profile within organisations and the industry as a whole, which is fantastic. We'll take that because we were often the afterthoughts as opposed to the people sitting at the table. So whilst it's been lovely to have that acknowledgement and that light shone on it from a practice perspective, in the back end, there was absolutely a heap of innovation being made at a very grassroots level. Nothing, we're not talking fancy technology pieces. We're just talking people dusting off their policies, pulling out their emergency plans, and rewriting those. I know for me specifically, I was based at an Australian government science agency when the pandemic hit, and I was literally rewriting the policy every 3 months because we had zero visibility, of what the the next 3 months was going to look like. We all thought it was only going to last 2 weeks, and then it continued on for many years. So innovation in its fundamental sense around policy, technology, COVID did, I'm not going to say wonders because that gives it too much positive credit because it was a terrible thing, but it did wonders in relation to speeding up and drawing attention to the need for innovation in our industry.
Thanks, Keryn.
Thanks, Lakitha.
We have 2 more questions, but they are on sustainability, so I'm just going to hold off
Sure.
for sustainability.
Sure thing. We'll keep moving. Thank you. The next piece, and sorry, we will get to the sustainability questions. The next piece I wanted to cover is strategy. So it's very easy when you're in a mobility program to get pulled into the BAU and the operational side of it, but it is really vital to take regular breaks, stick your head up, and think about the strategy, where you're going, what you're doing, what the organisation is doing, and are you still supporting? Is your solution still fit for purpose? And are you supporting the organisation in the way that you need to? And so I thought about this in a couple of different key areas, and the first one being talent shortage. So, we all heard about the Great Resignation, then it was the Great Realization, I think the US had. For us, I think we're still in the Great Resignation stage in Australia. But that all, regardless of what you wanted to call it, it all led to a talent shortage tsunami, I think is the best word I can use. And that was felt right across the globe. And so, again, out of COVID, because mobility was elevated in profile, and we were able to demonstrate quite clearly some of the value that the programs that we had provided. It is easier now to promote global mobility as a effective lever for recruitment in attracting talent to address that talent shortage. There are lots of things you can do in a mobility program that can potentially sway an individual candidate or can support an attraction piece if you're doing a large recruitment exercise. And by that, I mean there are services that you can offer. There are ways that you can structure your offerings that gives talent that edge. And it can be something just as simple as providing destination guidance or a tool to support the individual to understand what that destination looks like. I spoke about virtual reality in understanding destinations. Whilst that's in its early stages from a tech perspective, maybe that's the next frontier for us as a mobility program to offer that to candidates and not just internal employees, so they can see what it's like to live in Australia, what it's like to live in Texas. And that could be enough to push a candidate away from a competitor and to you. So these are all the differentiations that and the ways you need to think to get ahead, and the solutions that you can provide to your talent team that they can put ahead of themselves. The other piece there is around, I think probably the biggest subject at the moment, particularly in Australia, is the immigration pathways. The talent team is obviously taking guidance from the Global Mobility and or their immigration partner in relation to what immigration options there are to get people on shore, but what immigration pathways there are to keep them on shore. So the talent team need to be kept abreast by the Global Mobility team around what options there are available. And whilst a lot of legislation doesn't shift as fluidly enough to be opening up pathways constantly, we did see that happen quite a bit in COVID. There were lots of respite visas that popped up that provided avenues to people who were traditionally in country on short-term arrangements, but they were stuck. So it did open up a lot of pathways to permanent residency that hadn't existed before. And so it's around making sure that the talent team is kept across that, is briefed regularly. And the best way to make sure you do that is to make sure you have a really good immigration vendor partner that you can keep close to, and that they can keep you up to date so that you can keep your organisation and particularly your talent team up to date again, with using that as an attraction piece. There might be a candidate who's considering another organisation because they're offering permanent residency from the moment they sign on, whereas some organisations have PR wait times when you join an organisation. So again, it's another tool that you can use to address the talent shortage, and something that could be used to potentially sway a candidate away from another competitor and join your organisation. The operating model is shifted considerably probably in the last 3 years. There was a point at the start of the pandemic where mobility, I spoke to lots of colleagues, and we had shifted from global mobility practitioners to counsellors. So as you can imagine, a lot of people were displaced in countries that they didn't have any support, any family, and so their lifeline was global mobility for the organisations that they worked for. Whilst we probably do less personal counselling these days, we certainly have seen an increase in consultation with the business, particularly around the rise in hybrid working or remote working, and where that intersects with international destinations. It's less of an issue in the domestic sense, although I appreciate in the US there are some curly hurdles in relation to hybrid working in different states. The consultation around all of this hybrid working, remote working from global mobility back to the business has risen, and it continues to be that way, and I think it will continue to be that way for the next probably 5 years. On the complementary side of that, I guess the nice thing is that we're seeing a decrease in hands-on administration that a lot of mobility practitioners are getting involved in with that rise of technology solutions that are taking over a lot of that administrative work. So, for example, you would have a visa approved, which then the next natural step in the process would be to trigger your relocation partner for them to go ahead and start organising the shipment, organising booking flights, getting that person moving. Now, a lot of the mobility management platforms solutions provide an automated process between that step. So it just takes, I mean, it sounds very simple, but that action can save a mobility practitioner anywhere from half an hour to an hour, depending on how many stakeholders that they need to initiate. And then a big focus, I think, should be for every global mobility practitioner, and it certainly is for us here at Aurecon, is employee experience. So I personally believe that you need to anchor every area of the global mobility program through the lens of having exceptional employee experience. Your main customer, even though the business is very important, the manager who's approving the program is very important, the main important customer is the candidate or the employee that you're moving. How they enjoy or not enjoy the experience of relocating or going on assignment reflects heavily on your program. And so you need to invest a lot of time and effort into making sure that program brings out that exceptional employee experience. And so there's a few ways that you can do that. The traditional and kind of long-standing approach is to have your vendor partners conduct regular surveys with the employee at different milestones throughout the process. Often what happens though through that particular form of capturing of data is because it's done from a third-party external, often employees are less likely to engage with external parties, particularly in the world of increasing cyber attacks. You know, that kind of third-party reach out often now gets a lot more scrutiny than it once did. So I always find it good practice to make sure you complement your vendor partners' surveys with internal conversations as well. And I always find, depending on the size of your team, depending on the amount of bandwidth your team has, it's always good for the team themselves to have conversations either with current or repatriated assignees, because that lens that they're looking through during assignment and post-assignment is a completely different experience. And they're having a completely different personal interaction at that point. So it's always good to make sure you've got those regular touch points throughout that to make sure you're understanding the full employee experience and getting that real data. The next area I wanted to talk to was around compliance and governance, one that's very close to my heart personally, because I think without good compliance and governance, your program is open to a lot of vulnerability. So I guess again, with the rise of the mobility programs the mobility management platforms that are available now with the increasing technology solutions, the ability to track, and I spoke about carving up diversity data from programs now, the ability to be able to leverage that technology to pull diversity, volumes, trends, spend, so you can understand where the gaps are in your program is hugely important. It also provides real-time data, and that's particularly important. And again, this is a learning from COVID. It's particularly important now where we're having and we're seeing an increase in worldwide events. So they can be of something like COVID, a pandemic, but it can be also political events, so riots, terrorist attacks, things like that, where you need to understand where your mobility program is at the push of a button, and you're able to send in support through organisations like International SOS or whoever your emergency support company is. So having access to real-time data, whilst it can provide you good governance to identify proactive trends around your program, it's absolutely vital from a health and safety perspective that you understand where those people are. And again, another thing close to my heart was, that was a key learning from COVID, that reaction times need to be swift, and support needs to be there. And that's, of course, heavily, linked back to the employee experience as well. The employees need to understand that they're safe and secure when they're going on assignment or relocating for the organisation that they work with. And the last piece around strategy is education. We can never do enough of this when it comes to mobility. One, because if you're not doing a mobility activity as a business manager, as an employee, you tend to forget what it's all about. Us as practitioners who are immersed in this every day know this inside and out, but it's not everybody's bread and butter. And so because of the breadth and depth of global mobility and how it is implemented in a lot of organizations, it tends to sometimes be a big mountain that some can't get over. So education helps break down that wall, helps break down that perception that mobility is a blocker, it's a big hurdle. And so providing education material to the organisation around your principles, demonstrating that that's aligned to the organisational principles, and that your practices are there to support and not hinder is completely vital. And then it also adds a great deal of value if you can educate from an external perspective. So you bring in best practices, you bring in legislation updates, you bring in regular strategic initiatives that the talent and sourcing team can use to attract talent, but also that the organisation can use to keep that talent. So again, a really great tool and something that we can never rest our laurels on around education. We just need to keep doing it on a regular basis. Lakitha, any questions in relation to strategy?
Yes, we do have 2 questions. What are some of the key benefits of incorporating, that's sustainability again. I will just pull that part again. And there's one. How can companies develop contingency plans to mitigate the risks associated with the mobility programs?
Yeah, good question. I would have to say probably prior to COVID, a lot of organisations, particularly in relation to mobility, probably didn't have robust or up-to-date contingency plans around managing risk around their mobilised populations. They will do now, and I think that they will also continue to work with a lot of internal stakeholders like risk, like health and safety, to make sure that they have those policies kept up to date, and those learnings are applied. Some of the practical solutions that you can do, I spoke about just earlier, is around making sure that your technology solution provides you as real data as it possibly can. It doesn't have to, you don't have to spend a lot of money on a fancy mobility platform. It can be an Excel spreadsheet. You just need to make sure that you've got a resource dedicated to that spreadsheet that keeps on top of that data, and it is as real time as it possibly can be. But obviously, you know, if there is a budget, the mobility platforms do help manage that real-time data. You need to make sure that that data has the right feeders into it. So that includes your HR information system. So that might be something like Workday. Trying to think what the other ones are now, but basically your general HR information management systems need to feed into your mobility platform and vice versa. You also need to make sure that you plug into your travel program as well. So often in a lot of organizations, business travel, the organization where you'll fly to another office for a day back and forth, is often kept separate from the mobility program. Some organizations have them together, and a lot of practitioners like myself do manage both programs, but often it is separate. And so where it is separate, you want to make sure that you have synergy and integration between that population as well, particularly where we have stealth expats. So stealth expat, if you haven't heard that term before, it's where somebody should be being managed and monitored by the mobility program, but they've gone and taken a business trip instead. And so if you're not picking them up on your population, your radar to manage the risk associated with them traveling, they'll pop up on the travel radar because they've booked travel through the organization. So other than technology solutions and making sure you have that visibility, you need to understand the organization's risk appetite around not only the physical risks, so the in-person risk with being in a country, and that could be determined, that's usually determined by the risk department within your organization. They will have a view, or some organizations such as Aurecon, for example, we have a risk map. So it looks at all the countries in the world and it pulls data and determines their risk appetite for travel, but also mobility activities into various countries around the world. If they don't have a risk map, they'll certainly have a list of countries that are okay to travel to, or they don't. If you don't, as an organisation, have that list, there are government departments that determine risk factors associated with countries. In Australia, it's a website called Smart Traveller. I'm sure the US has something very similar, but there are lots of external, if not internal, resources that can help you determine your risk appetite from a physical perspective. But then you also need to understand your risk appetite from a compliance perspective. And by that, I mean exposure to corporate tax, your risk appetite around immigration, which of course should be zero. We should all have the right visas when we're working in country, but particularly in tax, we need to make sure that because it's such a grey area, and I love all the tax professionals out there, but I really wish it made more sense. But the tax legislation is often trailing human habit, and we're seeing that as we come out of COVID. We've got, you know, the rise of, you know, people who want to work remotely. They want to sit on a beach in Bali and do their job that they would usually do in Australia. But the tax legislation just hasn't caught up. We are seeing a rise in things. You might have heard of a concept called the nomad visa. Lots of countries around the world have developed a nomad visa, which offers people to travel in and do work remotely and sit on the beach and do their job. But you need to understand where those countries are, if your organisation has a risk appetite from a tax perspective to allow people to work into that, and then translate that risk appetite across to policy. So, for example, a lot of organisations will have a remote working policy, and it's a standard set of guidelines that says, Keryn, if you want to go and work in Bali and sit on the beach, you can do it for X number of days. And we as an organisation have determined that that's a reasonable amount of risk from a tax, immigration, and corporate exposure perspective. And so some of those policies are also coupled with requirements to take a holiday associated with that. but often more than not, they're just straight out remote working policies. So there are a set number of days, for example, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and then the individual is required to come back. But it's a greater level of risk to the organisation when you have a number of people travelling and doing that activity. And so it is a very personal decision for an organisation, and one that's often made at a leadership level with the feeders of information, risk, health and safety, global mobility. And again, that comes back to having the right data to understand where your people are, how many people you have in what country, what your current risk profile looks like, and then you can develop those risk mitigation approaches. Sorry, that was a big answer to a small question, but hopefully it addressed it.
I have a question.
Sure.
Since Aurecon operates in like different areas of the world, how do I put it? So how do you ensure that your global mobility strategy is flexible and adaptable to the different business needs and market conditions in different places?
Good question. I think at a fundamental level, it's about staying close to the business, making sure you understand what the business is doing, what their ambition is. So, for example, at Aurecon, sustainability is a huge backbone of our organisation, if not the main driver of our organisation. Now, we're in the design, engineering, advisory piece. So we do end-to-end solutions for our clients. And an example of a product that we would help produce in that end-to-end delivery would be like a stadium, for example, a football stadium. It could even be a road, for example, a major highway. What we're seeing at the moment from an Aurecon perspective, which is a demand being driven by our clients, is we have a focus on helping our clients realise sustainable solutions for their assets. So a stadium to our clients is an asset, a road is an asset. And so what we're seeing is rather than, I mean, it still does happen as well. There is innovation, there is development still going on where new stadiums, not stadiums particularly, but new assets are being developed, new assets are being built from scratch. But what we're seeing is a demand in growing in extending the life of that asset. So we're now operating again in a post-COVID world where there are supply-demand issues. It's really hard to get materials. It's really hard to get labour, and everything is very expensive. So a lot of our clients are looking towards making their asset more sustainable in extending the life of their asset. So rather than, you know, you'll often see when an Olympics or a Commonwealth Games, which is more relevant to Australia, you'll see, you know, when a Games is going to come to a city, for example, a lot of the infrastructure that exists and is old is kind of torn down and a brand new stadium is built. Now we're seeing a shift to, no, let's take that stadium, for example, and let's upgrade it. Let's make sure that it is sustainable and its footprint, its structure, its core, not only from a supply, demand, labour perspective, it's more advantageous to do that, but from a carbon footprint sustainability point of view, it's a lot smarter as well because you're reusing, you're renewing. And so we're seeing that as a big demand coming across our industry in engineering and design. And so for us to understand that as a global mobility program, that helps us design and make sure we tailor our programs with that in mind from an organisation perspective, but it also tells us what kind of talent that we're going to be looking for to deliver on that, right? So you've got a lot more focus on sustainability and renewal. So that particular talent may have a different appetite. It may be of a different seniority. It may want a full-blown international assignment package or a full relocation package, because we're talking about people who are in their 20 to 30 year stint of their career and they're used to all the bells and whistles, as opposed to, you know, where we may be looking to attract more grads to get fresh thinking into how we address sustainable solutions. So we may look to have leaner packages. So, and sorry, I've completely forgotten your question, but how we look to align ourselves is by understanding where the business is going, what they're doing, and making sure you keep your seat at the table and keep yourself relevant in that conversation. Because the minute you step back and you get too comfortable in running your program, is the minute you lose the disconnect from the business. Aurecon is all about innovation. And it would not be doing the brand justice if we didn't, as a mobility program as well, continue to innovate and evolve as well. So hopefully that answered your question, because I can't remember it specifically, but I remember the intent of it.
No, that was perfect. Like, it's really difficult to manage and operate in different parts of the world, knowing each part has a quite different market, what each market requirements are, and how do we meet them is very much important to a
Yeah,
company.
exactly. Yeah, and you raise a good point. The location that you're operating in as well is very important. A lot of foreign jurisdictions, so a lot of countries have government regulations around, particularly when you're talking about building assets like buildings, like roads. There is heavy investment from the government around what that looks like, and even to the level of detail around the number of foreigners that you can bring in to work on a particular project. That often needs to be balanced off with hiring of locals. So you need to understand the environment. You raise a good point, Lakitha, around understanding the environment you're operating in from a jurisdictional point of view, as well as your organizational aspirations in that location.
Thank you, Keryn.
I
guess
I'm just
forward.
conscious of time, so I thought
Yeah.
I might move to sustainability. Yeah, I could talk about this all day. Yes, last kind of slide on this, sustainability, one that's very close to my heart. And there, I kind of wanted to break this up into digestible pieces. And I think what makes most sense is what you can do internally within your organization, within your mobility program, but what you can actually do externally as well. So internally, again, it ties just completely, great segue, ties just into what we were talking about around understanding your organizational sustainability goals, your business aspirations, and then developing a mobility sustainable pillar under that, which aligns nicely with your organizational sustainable targets. And you do that by what we just talked about around remaining connected to the organization and having those internal conversations. You need to obviously review the policies which underpin and support that pillar or that program of sustainability within mobility. And that needs to, again, tie back to the organizational commitments. If there are particular sustainability goals, then you need to make sure that you have metrics that flow down into your policies, and then flow down even further into how you operationalize your program. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. You need to make sure that you're regularly revising your policies. So it's pretty good best practice to make sure that you're looking at your policies at least every couple of years, if not annually, if you have the bandwidth to do it and the program size to do it. But just making sure, again, based on that feedback from the employees and from your vendor partners, that your policies, your programs are still fit for purpose. Because some organizations, particularly in the tech sector, can move that quickly, that in a year you need to shift your approach into where you're executing your mobility program. And then you need to keep quite tightly connected to talent and mobility, for more so in the more recent years, have become quite closely aligned in the way they operate. Even some mobility programs are headed up by a talent lead. And those two are heavily connected because it feeds into a really strong leverage around attraction and retention. And as we push towards sustainability and we adopt different ways, the so too does the appetite from the candidate, the employee, around having sustainable options when it comes to mobility. So being able to present sustainable options, again, is another great attraction piece. It speaks highly to the brand. And so it could, again, be a differentiator between you and your competitors. So some of the ways that I've seen or I've heard of sustainability reflected in a mobility program or a policy is you can establish, again, working with your vendor partners, you can establish sustainability ratings for each of your policy benefits. So it could be, for example, you have, I don't know, like a 3-star rating, for example, or a numbered rating when it comes to your accommodation. It could be a similar rating for shipping, for example, but it might be rated less because of the carbon footprint associated with shipping people's goods from one side of the world to the next. But again, similar to the approach where I spoke about earlier around using a points-based system for your mobility program, the sustainability rating, again, gives that empowerment, that control back to the candidate, back to the employee, and puts the onus on them to make the sustainable choice. And again, if they are the right fit for the organisation, then you would hope that they would make the sustainable choice in line with the sustainable aspirations of the organisation when it comes to their relocation package. Another simple but effective method that I'm seeing across the industry is a change of provisions. So a simple change like shipment, rather than offering that of people's personal goods, you might provide them an allowance for furniture at the other end instead. There are, of course, there's lots of counter arguments around that about, okay, from a carbon footprint perspective, what do they do with all their furniture back home? Do they sell it? Do they renew it? Do they throw it out? Do they put it in landfill? All these conversations need to happen at an organisational level. So you can provide guidelines around these provisions. We don't want to encourage, a huge uptake in IKEA purchased furniture across the world, which results in a heap of furniture being dumped at the home location. So you just need to think about the end-to-end implications of changing your policies around these things. But certainly on the face of it, swapping shipments for allowances and purchasing furniture at the other end. For some organisations, if they have a carbon offset program, that can be a more sustainable option. And then another good partner around your flight and sustainability as a global mobility practitioner can be partnering with your procurement team. So speak to them around what sustainability commitments are embedded into your current vendor partner agreements. Now, they can be quite old. Usually a vendor partner agreement is somewhere between 3-5 years in length and longevity. So you may be sitting with an existing vendor partner agreement, a contract, which doesn't have any considerations for sustainability at all. As we know, sustainability, unfortunately, has only been a very recent kind of accelerated conversation. And so those historic agreements may not have it. And so therefore, you want to look to collaborate with your partners where those sustainability measures may exist in the current programs. You want to understand from them what they are doing to meet those already. They may have already introduced some measures that aren't reflected in your contract, so you want to understand what those measures are. But then you want to also push them a little as well and see what they're open to adopting as part of their ongoing service delivery. So you might have some initiatives in the organisation that you come up with. The shipping allowance for furniture, the allowance instead of shipping is an example of that. You might want to push your relocation partner to take up and adopt that initiative that you're generating within your organisation down to their service delivery for you as their client. And then that leads me to external. So when you're working with your vendor partners, when you come to that 3 or 5 year point where you're renewing your contracts and you go to RFP, you want to definitely take that opportunity, if you don't have it already, to introduce sustainable goals. And you need to make sure that that flows down to the actual service delivery that they're executing on. So these could include, as I said, current initiatives that could be up for negotiation. They may have aspirational goals as an organisation themselves. And then lastly, you want to make sure that they're committing to those goals and they're delivering on them. So you want to make sure that you build in measurable goals around seeing a return on investment effectively when it comes to your engagement for the life of the contract. And you would typically build that in around your KPIs or your SLAs. And I've seen some organizations in the past tie financial, not incentives, the opposite of that, penalties, financial penalties to vendor partners where they don't meet those KPIs. So it's in the vendor partner's best interest to make sure that they're downstream implementing the sustainable goals that you've agreed as part of your RFP contract initiation, and that they're flowing that on to their service delivery. So ultimately, I guess for sustainability, it's around taking a fresh look at your program through the lens of sustainability and finding ways to reduce your carbon footprint no matter how small the change seems. Thanks, Lakitha. Back to you.
4 questions. Whoa.
Sure.
How can companies ensure that their global mobility programs align with their overall sustainability goals?
Sure. So we touched on a little bit about this before, but again, fundamentally, it starts with having a seat at the table. If you're unable to get a seat at the table in the organisation for whatever reason, there are lots of avenues to understand what the organisation is doing. First and foremost, it's your intranet. So your internal internet site within the organisation. Make sure you're regularly checking that. Sign up to your organisation on LinkedIn. It sounds really simple, but it can be a really effective way to understand where the organisation is at from a narrative perspective, but also from an initiative perspective. So the organisation will have, by no doubt, a marketing team that is pushing out messages around what the organisation is working on. It may be sustainable, it may be not, but it gives you a really good insight into what the organisation is doing. So if you find yourself in an organisation at a level where you don't have that seat at the table, that's okay. There's still things that you can do as an individual contributor to be able to understand what the organisation is doing. And I think it's all of our responsibilities as citizens of an organisation to make sure that we understand what the organisation does. We tie back what we do every day to that strategy. And mobility is not immune to that whatsoever. And sustainability is just one example of tying that back to the overall strategy.
The next one is, what are some of the biggest challenges companies may face when implementing sustainable global mobility programs, and how can these be addressed? I guess.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's good. I think the biggest challenge companies will face is around understanding the landscape that they're operating in. So understanding best practice guidelines around sustainability, either as an industry. So for Aurecon, that would be the engineering design industry. For mobility, it would obviously be understanding what other mobility industries, either regionally. So for us in APAC, we look to the US and Europe to see what they're doing for a sustainability point of view. But it's around making sure that you understand the landscape you're operating in, whether it's an internal industry, whether it's an organizational industry, and then making sure you're positioned and benchmark yourself, you're positioned well within that landscape, and defining and clearly communicating your sustainability goals. The biggest, that would be the biggest hurdle, is understanding the ecosystem you're working in, but then also making sure that you communicate that clearly as well. So there's a lot of information out there, as we all know now, with social media. And so making your voice heard as an organisation or as a mobility program practice, I think would be the other big challenge. And I'm not a marketing thing by any means, so I can't talk to how to overcome that challenge. But certainly as a mobility program, if we wanted to push out our messaging, we would work with our internal team in comms and marketing to make sure that we we have the right people on the solution to overcome that challenge.
Thank you, Keryn.
Okay.
What are some of the key benefits of incorporating sustainability into the mobility strategies?
Key benefits. Well, the first one obviously is saving the planet. We all want to do that, right? But I think, I mean, whilst there is that longer term impact around reducing the carbon footprint, I think there is a strong argument as well around it strongly benefiting the bottom line, which of course speaks volumes to a lot of leadership teams. The other benefit to that, again, I touched on it briefly before, was around the brand impact and the positive brand impact. So as sustainability, environment gets increased media attention, people become more widely conscious of actions that they can take as an individual. And one of those, of course, is who they work for, what their organisation stands for. And so that attraction, retain, talent shortage piece is, if you have a really good sustainable program, generally as an organisation, but more specifically as a mobility program, that will go a long way in relation to recruiting and keeping talent, and the right kind of talent as well.
And the last question, and this is about the minimizing the carbon footprint that you've just spoken. Since the mobility industry is very internationally connected and requires lots of long-haul travel and transportation, how can companies balance the need for global mobility with the need to minimize the carbon footprint and promote sustainability?
Great question. So I have to be careful the way I answer this because I might put myself out of a job. But yeah, I mean, look, Australians know better than anybody else around, if you want to go anywhere, you've got to get on a plane. We're one big island. And so if we want to get off this island, we have to burn a lot of fossil fuels. So we're probably not a really great example, but yes, with globalization comes a lot of travel. We obviously saw that come to a pause during COVID, and there were no planes in the sky for a while. So whilst none of us want to go back to that, we need to figure out ways to offset that activity. And I think, you know, again, as a mobility program, it's tying back and leveraging that bigger ecosystem that you work within. So understanding what the organisation is doing, not only to mitigate carbon footprint, but to offset it. So, I mean, we all know that, you know, the easiest way or the simplest way or the most common way to offset carbon footprints is to plant a tree. I'm not an expert in sustainability by any means as a subject. And so I'm sure there are lots of other more clever initiatives other than planting a tree that we can do as mobility programs to offset the carbon footprint from things like flights and shipping of personal goods. But again, I would encourage any mobility practitioner to reach into their organisation, the ecosystem that they sit within, and leverage their colleagues. A lot of organisations now are deliberately appointing directors of sustainability, ESG. It's becoming an established separate, function within organisations. And so if that thought leadership doesn't exist within your organisation, there are lots of organisations externally that offer thought leadership presentations, and for free as well. You know, this isn't necessarily something that organisations need to pay for. There is a lot out there to access from a thought leadership perspective around sustainability. So I think a short answer to that long explanation is, I think whilst you can mitigate it, and I've spoken to that in length in the former slide around your programs and how you administer your program, inevitably there will be some sort of carbon footprint with any global mobility program. And so we need to look at how we offset that. And the best place to do that is with your organisation as a whole.
Thank you, Keryn. I'm done with questions.
Sorry, we ran over, Lakitha.
No problem. Thank you so much. It was way more informative and interactive. And thanks again, Keryn.
Pleasure, Lakitha. Nice to see you all. Take care.
Bye-bye. Have a good day
Bye.
ahead.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Bye.